Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host, Jacob Herman. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Price, a frequent guest of the History Valley podcast, and Dr. Blackhirst, who is also a frequent guest at the History Valley podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about Paul and Gnosticism. It is interesting that there are some texts that say that Paul is the founder of the heretical Gnostic movement, while others say that it was Simon Magus. Some, like Dr. Price, will say that that's intriguing clues that indicates that Simon Magus and Paul may have originally been the same character. And we're going to be talking about that today. Dr. Blackhirst has also written quite a bit on Gnosticism, and I have a link to his book in the description below. I recommend both of their books. They both have written great material on this. And Dr. Blackhirst has talked about Hephaestus and the Demiurge, Platonic Gnosticism. It's really fascinating stuff. Okay, so that being said, I want to start us off with a question for both of you, really. What do you both think about some church fathers saying that Paul was the founder of Gnosticism and others saying Simon Magus was the founder? Marcion thought that he was the true follower of Paul, and everybody else that claimed to be followers of Paul are just lying bastards. And in reality, people have misinterpreted Paul's message, that Paul's real message was that he rejected the Torah completely, and that Jesus is the son of a higher being, a moral being, contrary to Yahweh, who he thought was the devil. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, it seems to me that what Marcion is saying about Christians claiming to be Paulinists, but not really, because they've messed it up and confused the true Christian gospel and the true Pauline message with Judaism, is very much like what he said about Jesus, that he was intending to start a whole new thing with no connection to the Torah or Judaism, but the disciples just couldn't get that straight, and they figured, well, he must be representing Judaism somehow, must be some innovation in Judaism, and but that Marcion thought this is why Paul entered into the picture, that Jesus is up there at the right hand of God saying, oh boy, what's the matter with these guys? I better go down and recruit somebody who's not just some stupid fisherman and with some brains, and maybe he'll get it right. And he appears to Paul and so on. So he's doing the same thing. He's saying, you guys are just following in the footsteps of the disciples who couldn't get Jesus' distinctives right, and you can't get Paul's right.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that. I mean, the way the New Testament literature is set up is that you have the Jesus character who is somewhat mysterious. He wanders around and no one's really quite sure who he is. Is he Elijah, or is he John the Baptist, or connected to John the Baptist? And is he the long-awaited Messiah, or is he a prophet, or what is he? And even, I mean, Peter himself is the classic example of this. Peter himself doesn't. Some of the closest people to him don't really know who he is. And then you have the letters, you have the subsequent literature which tries to sort it out. And amongst all of the contenders, Paul is presented as the only person who could navigate through all of those signs and clues and work out exactly who this Christ figure was and what it meant. And the way this problem takes shape is, what's its relationship to Judaism? What's its relationship? What's its place in Second Temple Judaism? And what's its relationship to the various sects of Judaism? Noticing that the Pharisees get particularly bad press in the Gospels. But yeah, so Paul is presented as the person who sorts it all out, and he's the one person. peculiarly, because sort of the paradox here is that he didn't actually meet Christ. It happened subsequently. So all the people who met him can't really work out exactly who he is and what it means. But then you have Paul, who comes along and on the basis of a vision sorts it all out. That seems to be the structure that's presented. I tend to view all of this largely as literary constructions, and where they came from is another question, but I think that they're largely literary constructions, and that's how Paul goes. That's where Paul fits into it. He's the person who comes along and tries to sort it all out, and he doesn't appear until Marcion. So that's obviously significant.
Yeah, the first Paulinists we actually know of were those who commented on his epistles, and that's not, like Elaine Pagel shows, that's Gnostics and Marcionites.
Yeah.
And so who were the Corinthians and all that? That there seem to be fictive narratives,
Yes.
like the audience to whom Odysseus is relating his adventures in the Odyssey.
Yes.
He's not talking to them; they never existed. He's talking to the reader.
Yeah. That's right. And so you need to look at these as literary constructions. And I agree about these churches. I mean, we have these texts, but we don't have a matching archaeology. We don't have bricks and mortar that matches those texts. So that's one of the problems. I mean, there are lots of texts like that we can't match archaeology, but nevertheless, it's significant that Christian archaeology starts very late in the piece, and independent attestations of the Christian literature start very late in the piece as well. Until then, it appears to be a closed literature. And I agree what you say about the Corinthians and the others. These appear to me to be sort of fictive narratives, although noticing, though, that they participate in a very strong tradition of historical verisimilitude that goes back to Plato. I mean, I'm a student of Plato, and so I come at this material from Plato, and that's one of Plato's concerns. The way that we can be deceived by history, and the way that history is constructed, and the tension between mythos and logos, between the myth and the reasoned account. I tend to see the Pauline literature in that regard. Why does it take a Gnostic form? I think because they're trying to separate the whole thing from its Jewish foundations. It was originally attached to Judaism, and by the 2nd century, by Marcion's period, those connections are no longer necessary, because the whole Jewish settlement is being worked out. This is the canonical period of rabbinic Judaism, when they finally get their texts together, and after the Bar Kokhba revolt, it's sort of the end of zealotry and so forth, and it all settles down. It's no longer necessary, and so you can separate the whole thing from Judaism, and I think that's the role that Gnosticism largely plays. It's largely a Hellenizing influence that separates the nascent Christian movement from Judaism. I think that's how it goes. Yeah.
Yeah. I believe Chaim Maccabee and others have suggested that Gnosticism is the creation of would-be converts to Judaism who decided, wait a minute, this is not for me, and began to ridicule what they repudiated. That's a similar sort of a statement. It's not quite the same thing, but the central thing where Paul in Galatians says, nobody taught this to me. It was just revealed to me by the Lord himself.
Yes.
And that's kind of it in a nutshell, that you're saying, no, we're not growing out of something else.
Yes,
For the
that's
symbol
right.
was Paul versus the Jerusalem apostles, and the effect, the real point is, we're not part of Judaism,
Yeah.
and I guess never were. Maybe an exaggeration, but it's nuanced. He's saying, well, the Jews that knew about Jesus didn't understand him anyway, so that's a false start. It's really a kind of Judaism, what the Catholicism is, and we were our fountainhead of revelation was Paul. And this is even kind of reflected in the Pseudo-Clementines, where you have this debate between Peter and Simon, who, this is one of the things that tipped the Tübingen scholars off, that he's really Paul. Come on,
Yeah.
Peter is saying, look, if you were really an apostle of Christ, you'd agree with us. I mean, we went around with him. We know what he said. We heard it from the horse's mouth. And the rejoinder is, well, yeah, you heard something, but you know how easy it is for people to misconstrue things. Whereas if you have a direct revelation, it's like a bolt from the blue. There's no room for did he mean blessed are the cheesemakers or what? So even that is kind of this thing that it doesn't matter. If once we knew Christ after the flesh, we don't anymore. So it's really a whole new start. It's not Judaism. And the fact that Marcion seemed to consider Judaism true in its own terms, it just had nothing to do with Christianity. Is the Jewish Messiah going to come? Yes, he is, but that wasn't Jesus, and it's none of our affair when he does.
Yeah. That's right. So Marcion's putting a really stark division between the Hellenic mindset and Judaism, because I think it's you need to look at what's happening in Judaism at that period, in Marcion's period. The whole you have a sort of settlement that comes in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt and the First Jewish War, and all of that seems to settle down somewhat. The rabbis renounce any claim to Jerusalem and to the temple and so forth, and they clean up their books, and they expel the radical books, Maccabees and so forth, from the canon, and they come to sort of a rapprochement with the authorities in the empire. They find a place in the empire. So things that have been previously difficult are no longer, the whole situation has changed. And I think you need to see Marcion in that context. Judaism itself is moving away. So Marcion is just setting out new territory, I think, for Christianity. Yeah.
I'm interested, especially in what you said about the reason for rejecting the deuterocanonical books from the canon. I had never even thought of it having a political dimension, though what you say does obviously make sense. Like, why would they have dumped Tobit? That one, that's not incipiently revolutionist or
No,
even
true.
Solomon, but maybe it's just because they were in Greek and I don't know. That's
Yeah. But there's certainly different reasons. But as you see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the canon is very fluid. At this point, in Second Temple Judaism, it's a lot more fluid than we thought. When the rabbis finally settled the canon, there's a lot of stuff in there that was important in the period of the revolts that is no longer important and has been excised from the canon. Most conspicuously, the Maccabees, but they're still stuck with Hanukkah, which is sort of an uncomfortable, strange sort of festival that they have. They obviously know it's important, but they're not sure why. It's sort of incongruous in rabbinic Judaism.
Fascinating. Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Chaim Maccabee's work, although it's some time since I read it, and that's it. I think that's very valuable to have that sort of Jewish oversight of these texts, a deep Jewish critical engagement with these texts. I think that's important. So it's a good source, Chaim Maccabee. His arguments are certainly worth putting on the table, I reckon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was about to write some sort of a critique of Rene Girard and the scapegoat business and all of that, and he liked what I had written about it, but he said he was planning a book on it too, but I guess he never got around to it.
Yeah.
One of the most fascinating books I have ever read was The Sacred Executioner by him. That really,
I don't know that.
Oh boy, I'm sure I got the right
title.
author.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know it anyway. I don't know it by title or by him. Yeah. Okay.
It is really fascinating about how it fits right in with Rene Girard in some ways. The scapegoat, and then the secondary scapegoat who is blamed and all that. Whoa! He goes into symbology, the Gospels, and
absolutely. That's a very, very ancient theme. The scapegoat that goes through Judaism, and then into Christianity, of course. Sacrificial theology.
Speaking of Maccabee, stop me if I've blabbed this one before, but Carol and I had him and his wife over for dinner once, and we were talking about various and sundry things, and he mentioned an exegetical problem that the rabbis had traditionally said this was such a tough nut to crack, we would have to wait till Elijah returns to explain it.
Yeah, right. Yep.
But Chaim Maccabee did explain it, and they said, you must be Elijah. He actually cracked the thing. And it was amazing.
Oh, well, they leave a seat for Elijah at the table. So, yeah.
But we're the only ones that did that, and he sat down in it.
Yeah.
Had him over.
Yeah. I was in preparation for this session. I was reading through my notes from a long time ago, and I was reminded that you go through our sources with the hardest of hard criticism. Let's go through it really tough. And once I asked the question, where is the first absolutely indisputable reference to the Christians that you can't put a question mark behind? And I still think that the answer is in Lucian. It's in Lucian, extraordinarily. It's in Lucian's Life of Paragranus. That's a remarkable text where, what is it? It's about 140s, 150. We can date it because Paragranus famously burnt himself to death at the Olympics. He was a very famous character, and Lucian wrote an account of his life and a satire of him, made fun of him. But Paragranus was a famous person in that period. And amazingly, Lucian says that Paragranus exploited the Christians and wrote their texts. He explicitly says that, and he refers to the Christians and so forth. As far as I can tell, that's the first absolutely rock solid, independent independent reference to the Christians and the Gospels and the texts. So I reckon that they're up and around, although he doesn't mention the letters of Paul, he just says books in general. But I think that they're all up and around by 140, 150s. That's the date that I would put on these texts.
Well, some people have, I think Cliff Carrington argued that the texts that he wrote, Paragranus wrote, were the epistles attributed to Ignatius, and that both of them martyred and so on. I've wondered if anybody is ever, I halfway think I remember somebody saying maybe Paragranus was the historical Paul.
Yeah. That's right. I have run into that as well. Certainly there's something strange going on that's signaled there by Lucian, but I don't think we're in the position to work out what it was. For a start, what he presents is a satire, and you don't know what's what he's taking license with and what he isn't, and so forth. But nevertheless, it's a fascinating notice that you get, and as far as I can tell, that's sort of the first really solid one that you cannot put any sort of question mark behind. Its connection to the Pauline epistles, that's entirely, or Ignatian, that's conjecture, isn't it? Because Lucian doesn't tell us. But certainly things are up and around by that time.
Well, he does say that the writings that Paragranus wrote for Christians are esteemed as second only to the words of the founder. Like, who could that be?
That's right. He gives us some information, but then after that we have to speculate about what these texts were and whether in fact it's a reliable notice or just satire. But if you're looking for a structural date, I think that Lucian is a structural date. You can't deny that Christianity and its texts are current by that time. Noticing that that's 100 years later than the Orthodox the Orthodox dates.
I remember Tertullian saying that that Marcion discovered Galatians to discredit the Gospels. And in another place, he goes as far as claiming that Marcion is behind the letters attributed to Paul, not just Galatians. And see if I can see it here. He says, it says somewhere, and he says it somewhere here and against Marcion, that he's insinuating that Marcion was behind more than just Galatians.
That Tertullian thought this, or that he's mentioning a claim of Marcionites or something?
Now, Tertullian thought this.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Boy, oh boy.
Yeah, the Ante-Nicene Fathers are interesting, aren't they? Because it hasn't all been tightened up by then. You get some wild cards in the Ante-Nicene Fathers.
Wow.
That
would be a mighty interesting article or book right there.
Maybe I can put something together. But yeah,
so let's just work it out. So the situation with the Pauline letters, we're led to believe, is that they were written in 40s, 50s of the first century, and then they disappeared, and then they re-emerged at the time of Marcion, fully intact, and here they all are. That's the general scenario, yeah. I mean, I don't think we have anything in between those two things, do we? We don't have any.
Well, there are. What's this guy's name? Oh boy, I wish I could remember. I'm losing it. some have argued that there are solid references to Pauline epistles in the Apostolic Fathers and so on, but they seem to be very strange, as if the writers didn't really know the text they were talking about. Like in, I think Polycarp mentions that, in his letter to the Philippians, he says, as Paul wrote to you in all his letters. How many epistles of the Philippians did he know of? Now, I know Bornkamm and Schmithal's both independently chopped Philippians up into three shorter letters or fragments, and it's pretty plausible. It's possible that Polycarp knew that, but I kind of doubt it. There's other ones like that, in First Clement, whoever wrote that, it's anonymous. He says, take up Paul's letter to you. Well, was there only one?
Yeah.
I guess you can't be sure what they mean, but there are odd things like that. And it seems on the whole that there is a crashing silence about Paul in the 2nd century until apologists decide to co-opt Paul and Irenaeus and Tertullian. But before that, did they know about him and were scrupulously avoiding him? And this gets tied in with, did the author of Acts know the Pauline epistles? Because you can make a good case that he couldn't have, but Richard Purvo and others have more recently said, oh yeah, I think he did, and he got this bit from this epistle and all that. I'm not up with that debate, really. I don't know who to believe.
Nor am I.
What is curious about Acts is it talks about Paul's life largely, pretty much before the war, and it never mentions that he wrote any letters in the time period it covers at all.
Yeah, and this in a story where other people's letters are quoted in whole.
As if he didn't write it yet.
I mean, which is a possible scenario that you have the invention of the character Paul Saul at some stage, and then a literature was written and attributed to him at a later date. That's what you'd sort of expect. In which case, I'm sort of really interested in the literature as such. I've decided that the Pauline literature is not from the period that it claims to be, and it's from a much later period, and therefore it's pseudepigraphal. But then it's beautiful literature, and so it's beautifully done. The Gospels are too. This is really, really good literature, like in terms of creating the illusion of historicity. It's very, very competent literature in that case. And you have to explain that. You can't just say, well, I can prove that it comes from a different period. You've got to explain the historicity of it, or the appearance, the verisimilitude of historicity that you get in these texts, which is really quite extraordinary.
When people just dismiss, like I found that at the Jesus seminar, we had a Paul seminar for a while also, and Darrell Dowdy and I were expounding some version of the Dutch radical approach, and you could tell they thought we were insane. And these are people that, Jesus, well, he may have said a few things, but when Paul, oh no, we got to have the lucky 7 epistles that are authentic. And to me, residual Protestantism. Well, the idea, like I think of what Paul says in Acts, why should it be considered impossible among you that a man should rise from the dead? Well, the same thing, I felt like, why do you consider this so far out? Because no critical scholar thinks that the truckload of Peter pseudepigrapha goes back to Peter.
That's right.
The 2 letters in the New Testament, and it doesn't surprise them. Peter was the big wig. People are going to invoke him. Why not recognize at least that it's possible in the case of Paul, especially since some of these letters actually say there was a cottage industry of spurious Pauline epistles going.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
Mm.
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? I taught biblical studies to undergraduates for years, about 15 years. So it's an introductory first year subject. But it's one of the most difficult things to teach, because in any given class, you've got 4 or 5 different paradigms that students are approaching it with. You can have, all the way from inerrancy, all the way through to hypercritical, and then you get people in between that the Gospels are they're late, but the Pauline epistles they're good, or Galatians at least is good, and you get different paradigms and different ways of approaching those texts, and it's extremely difficult. It's very fragmented. It's a very fragmented intellectual field. And you can see this in journals too. There are some journals that subscribe to particular paradigms, and they accept a certain shape of history and they write within it. And then there are others like, say, Robert Eisenman. He's got a different paradigm. He works within a different paradigm. He's happy with some of the Pauline epistles, but not the others. And then there's Dutch radicals and others who work on a different paradigm again. And they can't communicate between each other. It's an extraordinary. There's no solid agreement about these things, least of all the Pauline epistles.
In one of my books, The Amazing Colossal Apostle, I take the Dutch radical approach, commenting on these epistles and how none of them are authentic. But then I found myself doing another book, one of my series, Holy Fable, the Bible Undistorted by Myth. And in the one dealing with the epistles, I said, now, if you followed any of my stuff, you know what I would say about these epistles. But I recognize this is just a paradigm, a heuristic device to try to understand. But let's see what they make if you look at it through this, what sense they make if you look at it with these glasses on. Well, what I'm going to do in this book is to operate with the standard paradigm of at least the 7 are by Paul. Now, if that's the case, what do we make of them? What are they saying? Because it's so very different than, not only who wrote them, but what they're about. And I found it pretty easy to do that, which just shows it's like, which pair of glasses do you want to put on?
Yeah, exactly. When I was teaching this subject, that's right. I'd have to have 5 or 6 different sets of glasses, and change them over depending. You just do, because it's a very open sort of field in that regard. But everyone's in their own little camps, and they can't communicate with each other. It's they're all working in different paradigms and different models, and it's hard to keep track of them all. Yeah.
The Jesus Seminar suffered from that in its early years, because with reference to Jesus, you had one. I mean, the great hope was you'd get all these scholars together, like the Council of Nicaea, and come up with a verdict on how much of the gospel material was authentic. But you had one group that was interested in literary criticism of the Gospels and didn't really care about the historical roots of them. Another one that insisted they had to be interpreted according to the canons of anthropology and sociology. Others had said, oh no, there was a historical Jesus, we got to get back to him. And within that group, Jesus was an apocalyptist, or no, he was a wandering sage like the cynics. And what are you going to do with that? That's right. Yeah. And so gradually they dropped away. Each group was, oh, forget it, I got nothing to say here.
Yeah, that's what happens indeed. That's very difficult. Yeah.
I had this great idea, if I can pat myself on the back for it. there was the Jesus Seminar, which is still going in some form. And then there was this brief experiment that the Center for Inquiry, the humanists in Buffalo, tried to set up called the Jesus Project. Joseph Hoffman was really the force behind that. And that sounded like it was going to be real good, but it immediately collapsed. And I thought, okay, here's what we ought to do. Let's have some kind of regular meetings in which we bring in mainstream critics, hyper critics like Jesus mythicists and Dutch radical sympathizers and all that, and sophisticated apologists. And at each meeting, we would have a representative of one of those groups give a paper, and both other groups would critique it, and then it would rotate.
Yeah.
I think that would be great. I mean,
That'd be terrific. Yeah.
Get but I don't know who's going to do it now. It would be great though.
Yeah.
I'd be very interested in having more discussions about that here. Yeah.
At this stage, it has to happen in the private realm, because the university system operates in its own paradigms. And as you know, you can't even find a mythicist in universities, so it's very hard. Even that basic point that you can consider Christ as a mythical figure rather than a historical figure, that just doesn't appear on the map in academia. It's so things are very restricted in academia. It seems to me that real headway with these sorts of discussions has to happen in private forums at the moment.
Yeah.
I was involved with a Book of Mormon seminar at Brigham Young University, and we had a couple of meetings, and it had the same sort of range of people. There were official apologists from the LDS Church. There were more liberal Mormons, and there were people like me who don't hate Mormonism, but want to study it academically and respectfully. And so you get into the big issues. Was this an ancient book or one from the 19th century? And sometimes you just couldn't get past that. And eventually BYU nixed the whole thing after 2 meetings.
Okay.
Anymore.
Yeah. Oh, that's a pity, because that sounds like a very worthwhile thing. I'm glad you have that sort of attitude to Mormonism, because in my classes I had a lot of Mormons over. There are a lot of local Mormons here, surprisingly, and they were always good students. I always found them very good students and very good people to get along with, and very and we had lots of discussions about Book of Mormon and all of that. Yeah. So a proper respectful discussion about all of that would be good, wouldn't it? It's very hard to find online. All you find is abuse and ridicule and polarized sort of stuff.
Well, since the beginning of our Journal of Higher Criticism, we've made it clear that we want critical studies of the Book of Mormon, and we got some that were very good, and they're all respectful. And because it doesn't matter when it was written, if you're just saying this is the functioning scripture of a sincere religious movement. Was Joseph Smith a prophet? Obviously he was. Now, whether God sent him or there is a God, that's none of my business. That's another matter. Was Sun Myung Moon the Lord of the Second Advent? Well, obviously he was. That's the role he played in that group. That's all you need to know, and then it becomes worth studying.
Yeah. That's right. I think like that too. It becomes worth studying just in that context, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, I also studied. Went fairly into the study of Scientology as well. That's a very tricky subject. That got me into a lot of trouble. actually. Like there were people in the university that really objected to my sort of respectful research into the Scientology movement. You know, people, especially anti-cult people. They just think, they're cult busters. They're not interested in the careful study of these things. They got a different agenda altogether.
Once I was teaching pinch hitting for a Jesus seminar friend, Richard Arthur, who taught at the Unification Seminary up in Barrytown. And I'd gone to a lot of Unification ecumenical conferences and always found the people fascinating. And so he was in a car accident, and while he was recovering, he arranged for me to take over his classes up there. And it was loads of fun. But the very first session, the first day, I had this big room full of Moonies, and there was suddenly this hugely loud pounding outside. I said, "What is that? Does anybody know?" He said, "Yeah, they're felling some trees for construction." I said, "Oh, that's a relief." I thought maybe it was the AntiCult network besieging it.
Yeah. That's right.
And they laughed. Gotta hand it to them.
Did they? Yeah, great. Yeah. Whereas one doesn't really get the impression that Christianity began like a cult like that. You know, people have this idea that these small groups, the Moonies or the Scientology, that this is like the Roman period where there's lots of little sects and groups, and the Christianity was one of these, and it sort of developed from the ground up. I'm dubious about that narrative, and so Paul becomes very important in that narrative, doesn't it? Whether you in fact had these vigorous missionary activity that explains the growth of the early church or not. I'm very dubious about all of that. Just that whole narrative.
Just look at the Epistle to the Romans. Paul writes, or he's represented as writing to the church he didn't start, and there's no statement as to who did. Well, wait a second. I mean,
That's
there,
right.
it's a cameo of the problem. Where'd these people come from? It wasn't like one guy like Johnny Appleseed going around and starting them all up.
Yeah. That's right. Which is the sort of standard narrative. That's what the residual narrative is, that you had these sort of characters wandering around planting seeds in the pagan world, and the Christianity grew out of all of that. Yeah, it doesn't really, that's how it's presented in the literature, but I don't think that conforms to what seems to have happened.
But there's also something strange in Romans chapter 16, verse 22. It says, I, Tertius, wrote this letter. And it's like, to me, that contradicts Romans 1, right very immediately, because okay, wait a minute now. Was it Paul or Tertius is writing this? And now some scholars will say, well, Tertius was the amanuensis for Paul's scribe, which it never says that.
Yeah, I've wondered about that too. Is this a little wink to the reader?
That he's the real guy that wrote it.
Yeah, that's right.
The business, one thing that Marcion didn't take for granted, and he was apparently the only one who didn't, was why Jesus goes to the trouble to ordain 12 disciples to go spread the word throughout the world. But then here comes Paul. Who's this guy? Where does he come from out of left field? Why is he there at all? And it seems to me that has to mean that you had a fusion of different groups, and then you start thinking of passages about another Jesus, a different gospel, and because it doesn't fit at all. And Marcion at least had a theory as to what happened. Well, Jesus had buyer's remorse. These guys were all stupid palookas, so he had to go find somebody better. But nobody's going to say that if you're venerating the 12, which he didn't. I mean, that cries out. I try to make some sense of that in my Judaizing Jesus book. It's just a theory as to, and involving Paul as Simon Magus and so forth, but that it's two different religions coming together.
Yeah, I hadn't considered it like that. Maybe, yeah, okay, I'll think about that. Certainly, you've got what you got is that motif that Paul, who didn't meet Christ, has a more legitimate witness of him than the people who did, and you know that somehow you got to explain that structure in the texts because it's counterintuitive. It's you know, it's not what you'd expect. And that's the thing. You have to be drawn to the peculiar and unusual things in these texts because they're the keys. The things that don't make sense.
And when you start trying to explain the anomalous data, as Thomas Kuhn calls it, you may wind up with a whole different paradigm. If you start with the troublesome stuff, who knows what you're going to come up with? Yeah,
that's right.
Here's another odd bit. Tradition preserves some letter from some guy, I don't remember his name, who wrote to Muhammad, supposedly, and said that he too was an apostle. And he wanted to make some sort of arrangement with Muhammad. What does that hint about the religious laboratory from which Islam emerged? I have no idea, but it's odd to find such a thing. What was he an apostle of?
Is that Bahira the monk? Is that the story?
I don't know. Probably so, if it rings a bell.
Okay, yeah, okay. That's right. The early Islam, the Christian, Judeo-Christian overlaps in early Islam are really fascinating, but also very, you know, hidden in the dusts of the desert. It's hard to track. I'm interested in that field, the critical history of the Quran and the early Islam, but that's a minefield. Yeah, but nevertheless, very important here because clearly Islam is. Like I come at this through my studies of the Gospel of Barnabas, which is a very anti-Pauline text, explicitly anti-Pauline. And there's the whole question of the relationship between Barnabas and Paul, which is sort of like, you know, the relationship between Hellenized Christianity and Jewish Christianity. Islam clearly comes out of that Jewish Christian sort of milieu, surely, because it is itself a Jewish Christian movement in a way. You know, it's a compromised position or a third position. In fact, it's foreshadowed, isn't it, in the words of James in Acts of the Apostles, when James says he sets down the law. He sets down the laws of the law of Noah. You know, he says, you know, that you can't eat birds of prey and so forth. And he sets out the things that apply to Christians. Which laws apply to Christians? It becomes the question. And that's what he sets out there is a prefiguring of Islam. That's the Islamic position. You know, it's a Jamesian middle position. That Gentiles are welcome, but they have to observe certain parts of the old law, and that's where Marcion comes in, who says no. What happens here is that Christ doesn't take us back to the covenant of Noah; he takes us back to the covenant of Adam. That's the essential move that Paul makes there. It seems to me. Islam is anti-Pauline in that respect because it only accepts the law of Noah, the covenant of Noah, legally speaking, in that sort of Judaism and Islam are jurisprudent traditions.
Eisenman points out the parallel between Islam and what is said in Galatians about Abraham. You can kind of do an end run around Judaism because Abraham was the one that made the covenant with God, and that may have something to do with the reason that the various Jewish Christian sects and Islam have nothing to say about the canonical prophets. That what happened to them? Well, the Samaritans, I guess, weren't too interested in them either, and Michael Cook and Patricia Crone say that there's evidence that Islam was sort of triangulating, trying to establish a distinctive identity. And so they're borrowing this from Judaism, this from Samaritanism, this from Jewish Christianity, and so forth. It sure looks like that.
Yeah, something like that. I've read Patricia Crone. Don't know. There's now at least she's opened up the question, those sort of questions. Yeah, that's right. But I don't know the story of the apostle that wrote to Muhammad. I don't know that story.
I got to look that up. I probably have all the books I would have found it, and I'll see if I can find it. It struck me.
Unless it's there's lots of stories about a Syrian monk, Christian monk named Bahira, who was a friend of Muhammad, and you do get you do get early suggestions that he tutored Muhammad in a Syrian style of Christianity.
And so some people suspect that the big number of Jesus sayings in Al-Ghazali might go back to Syrian Christianity. And that's like a whole separate Q source. That is so amazing.
Absolutely. And you get people like Shlomo Pines and people like that who are Judeo-Christian scholars who realize that a lot of this stuff ends up in Arab manuscripts, hidden gospels that make their way into, in parts, preserved in Arab gospels. That's a whole field that we haven't even, goodness me. That's very difficult.
And what would this?
But certainly the Jesus that goes into Islam is a very ascetic Jesus, and there's a large body of material, and we've only just scratched the surface of where all that comes from. It's clearly Syrian, though. It seems to be have that geographical region. And of course, that Patricia Crone and others that suggest that the Quran essentially was originally a Syrian lectionary. Or something like that.
Some of the sayings of Jesus in Al-Ghazali really are striking and have meant something to me. I mean, they've given me a perspective on certain things where I say, I remember this one, like the one where he sees this old man digging a ditch or something, and he's frail, but he's at it. And Jesus says, God, take away his hope. And he's watching the guy from concealment. And the guy says, what am I bothering with this for? I'm old and weak. He throws the shovel away and just sits down. And then Jesus says, God, give him back his hope. And he says, well, look, what am I doing? I'm not dead yet. I've got to use the time I have. And he gets back up and starts digging. And I often, the older I get, the more I think of that and say, yeah, that's right. I don't know how long I've got, but damn well better use it. Sort of Heideggerian. And there are other things in there, like Jesus. Somebody says to Jesus, where did you learn all this wisdom? And he says, nobody taught me. I just saw the foolishness of the fool and avoided it. And stuff like this, it's really good stuff. Who knows who said it?
So where did that come from? Where did all that come from? That's right. I mean, some of it you can trace to the the Protevangelium of James, and other Christian literatures, reflections of that, or direct steal from that. But there's a large body of material that goes into Islam. Obviously early material, and we just don't know where it came from or how it fits in. Yeah, it's very difficult.
Do you think the Docetism in the Quran comes from Gnostic converts to Islam?
That's
Christians?
that's very difficult. I'm not sure. When you ask questions like where did it come from, it's certainly there, and it's certainly come from early Docetic themes in Christianity, or even in the things like the Clementine recognitions and other places. There's all sorts of themes there, because I've been tracking them back from the Gospel of Barnabas. The Gospel of Barnabas provides us with a full Docetic theology, really, and you can trace it back from his sources. How it comes into Islam, though, is another question. I'm not sure. But it's part of the parcel, isn't it? It's part of that Jamesian law of an abrogation of some aspects of Jewish law, but the preservation of some others. The acceptance of Christ, but not of his messiahhood, and so forth. They're all prefigured in early Christianity, and in different groups. Gnostic as a broad term, yeah, they're Gnostic, aren't they? Yeah, but I'm interested in the Gospel of Barnabas because it gives us this full anti-Pauline Docetic Christianity, very, very carefully worked out, much more carefully worked out than would meet the eye, because on the surface, it's not a well-written text or anything like that, but there's an awful lot of background and thought gone into it, much more than it appears. Yeah, but explicitly anti-Pauline, and that's one way to deal with Paul, is to look at his enemies, to look at the anti-Pauline themes in Christianity and other sources. I think that's really useful.
Like the Ebionite claim that Paul wasn't a Jew. He was a frustrated convert. That's not so stupid when you start thinking of this business about the law as a burden, impossible to bear. Would a born Jew think that? Well, it's certainly obvious that a Gentile trying to be a Jew would think so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Paul, of course, claims to be all things to all men, doesn't he? So he's got a very flexible passport.
That's almost docetic by itself. Just like Origen said that Jesus appeared differently to different people.
Oh, yeah.
Their
that's
spiritual
right.
Status.
Yeah, fluid identities. That's right. Yeah, Paul's a very mysterious character, even if we take it at face value. The letters and Acts of the Apostles and whatever else we know, he's a very strange and mysterious character, isn't he?
Also, I think that's made worse by the fact that the early Christians identified Titus Flavius Clemens with the Clement mentioned by Paul in the letter to the Philippians and Pope Clement of Rome. And Roman historians like Suetonius, it might be somebody else I'm forgetting. They mention Clement being really young in the 80s, 60s, a child, when the Flavians fled their household in AD 69, 68, the year of the four emperors. And that would mean he was at best an infant in his mother's womb around AD 60. So if Philippians was written in the 50s, was he exiting his mother's womb or biolocating simultaneously and just preaching the gospel with Paul? I just think that's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Right. I remember once I was speaking to a friend, a Bible study group in his church. He was a pastor. And we were supposed to be talking about some of the Nag Hammadi texts, and I was going on about the Nag Hammadi apocalypse of Paul, and it suddenly dawned on me, they never mentioned Jesus in this. Paul is the
Okay.
ordained savior. He's the one that has the
Yeah.
encounter with the demiurge. What the heck?
Yeah.
I've always kind of suspected that Paul was the savior in a different sect that merged. The weird things that are said about Paul, like his parousia is delayed. Now you may think I'm not coming, but I am. Don't let anybody tell you different. And my sufferings completed those of Christ.
Yeah.
Several other things like this, and the whole thing in First Corinthians 1, I guess, I hear there are divisions among you, my brethren, and I nearly believe it, because one says, I belong to Paul, I belong to Apollos, Cephas, and Christ. Wait a minute, these others were on the same level with Christ? Doesn't that mean that this attests a period where, like John the Baptist was a competitor of Jesus, but eventually Christianity went out and swallowed John? Is that what happened here? That these other figures originally had nothing to do with Jesus, but eventually they were shrinking and decided, well, this is the closest thing to us, let's join up. I mean, who knows? But these things don't mean nothing. They have to mean something.
They must. Yeah. That's right. Oh, the Nag Hammadi texts are very strange, aren't they? Because they're strange to us, at least because we've been brought up with the canonical narrative, and so that's normal. And then we read this other literature and we say, what? That doesn't, that's extraordinary. But in the context, if you didn't have the canonical narrative so set in stone in your mind, you'd be able to see it fresh. That's why, the Jewish scholars are very good at this, because they don't carry that baggage with them. They're rather independently minded in that regard. I think that's important to do that, to familiarize yourself with the unusual.
Yeah.
And things like that. Those Nag Hammadi texts, some of them are wild, some of them are strange, but they must mean something. Something must have happened to get those texts into that shape. And is it a case of there's lots of little sects and groups who are all independent of each other? That seems to be what's going on.
Yeah.
But I'm not convinced of that. I'm not convinced that that's what's happening. Recently, I was looking at Paul. One of the places Paul goes is Iconium in modern-day Turkey, in Anatolia. So it's the modern city of Konya. And he's chased out of Konya. He and Barnabas are chased out of Konya. The people of Konya didn't like him at all. So it gets a bad press in the story. And in fact, when they head off to somewhere else, Lystra or somewhere else, or towards Antioch, the people from Konya, from the Iconians, actually follow him and try to, but anyway, in the context of that, just side reading to all of that, and that region in Turkey, Anatolia, it's what you got there are the Cappadocian fathers. And so I just dipped into a few of those and had a look at what was there, because no one ever looks at them. And the extraordinary thing about them that I noticed was that they were criticized by other church fathers and other figures for being not sufficiently intellectual. And the specific complaint against them is that they had produced amongst their, in Cappadocia there, in Cappadocian Christianity, a popular Platonism, a folk Platonism. They had seeded, the Cappadocian fathers had seeded a folk Platonism throughout Cappadocia. And, I'm just sort of trying to work out exactly what that means. But if you're looking for the roots of roots of Gnosticism and a lot of Gnostic themes, it seems to me that a lot of it could be a folk Platonism rather than being it's not a highly intellectual Platonism such as you get in Plotinus or something like that, but there's a folk Platonism in the Greek world, and I found an example of it here in Cappadocia because the Cappadocians are criticized for it.
Wow.
Yeah, if you're looking I'm trying to work out where this Gnostic stuff came from. It seems to be sort of Platonic in a way. It's let's just follow the demiurge, for instance. I'm following the demiurge here. Where does that come from? Well, it's not an intellectual version of Plato. It's not Plotinus's version. It's not Iamblichus or anything like that. Instead, it's sort of a bastardized version of Plato or the demiurge, and one can imagine it forming out of a folk Platonism. And I'm beginning to wonder just how widespread that was in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, just how deep that folk Platonism was and how much it fed into Gnostic forms of Christianity.
I find it interesting that you brought up Paul at Iconium, because Tertius is mentioned in later Christian literature as being a bishop of Iconia.
Is he?
Yeah, he is. The Tertius in Romans 16:22.
Really? Oh, I need
Yeah,
to follow that up. I want to know about that.
It's kind of weird because it sounds like
yeah.
a passing equivalence between the two. Like somebody confused the two guys as the same person. Like the Clementine recognitions says that Paul murdered James, but in Josephus it was Ananias that murdered James. And in Acts, Ananias, as it renders it, taught Paul. And I've talked about that extensively in the past. I'm like, it almost looks like it almost looks like people are confusing who Paul is, that they're not even sure who he really is. And that's interesting to me, because that really shows that there's a huge problem with attributing any of the letters to Paul if they're not even sure who the guy is, and letters can't even agree who wrote what. Like Romans, it's a disaster.
Yeah.
Even
Interesting.
The Saul-Paul thing makes you wonder, is it
yeah.
a harmonization of two people?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Is Saul one of the
Go ahead.
prophets too? Is Saul one of the prophets too? That's the question. Is Paul one of the apostles too? There's those reflections back into what is it, Samuel and those texts. Yeah.
Well, I tell you, this shows I'm using the Bible as a Rorschach test, I guess, but it occurred to me that when they say, is Saul also among the prophets, does this somehow reflect some canonical debate, some book of Paul, or in which Saul, or in which he figures largely, like First Samuel? Some people thought it shouldn't be in there. Samaritans wouldn't want it in there, but I realize that's just, a house of cards. Is no way to know. But about the weirdness of the Nag Hammadi texts. A great example of what you're talking about is in Stephen Davies' book about the Gospel of Thomas and Christian Wisdom, I think it's called. He takes one of the weirdest sounding Thomas passages, unless you make a hand in place of a hand and a foot in place of a foot. And an eye in place of an eye, and make the inner as the outer, and so forth, the male as the female, you'll never see the kingdom of the Father. He says, sounds weird, but it wouldn't if we were more familiar with this, because all of this is easily understandable as aspects of baptism. You're divesting yourself of the standard three stumbling blocks and all of this. I thought, yeah, he's right. There are a bunch of these things that if we had heard them in Sunday school in a different context, we'd say, oh yeah, man, we ought to have that in the New Testament. But it sounds so weird because well, some of it, the ideas are unorthodox, but some of it, it's just the language that seems strange.
Yeah. But there's all sorts of strange things that don't fit into our expectations. Like, for instance, let's take the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the stuff that you'd expect to find, and then there's new stuff, which is great. But then there's stuff like the Brontologion, you know, how to predict the future from thunder. And then there's horoscopes, and then there's all sorts of strange stuff in there. In the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The names of the angels. Why do you need to know that? Well, probably because you would be passing by them and you had to know the password, their names, just like a Gnostic. Well, who knows?
Yeah, that's right. That, like you get in the Egyptian afterlife. That's sort of in the. That's right. Yeah. And a lot of this stuff seems very strange to us, but that's because we've been brought up in the very sanitized version of the canonical stories. Yeah. Obviously, Christianity was much stranger than we think in the early period. Yeah.
Somebody who's an anthroposophist, I can't think of his name, but he's a trained New Testament scholar. He made a really convincing case that the Apocalypse of Adam at Nag Hammadi is a Zoroastrian text, which Jesus has just been stapled on to the end of, because it's the series of illuminators who come to the water, one after the other, and he says, well, it's pretty evident who these figures are, comparing it with Zoroastrian and Persian lore, and then Jesus is added on to it. But they probably, if they were simply Christians from Persia, they probably wouldn't have had this long preamble. He convinced me, and I think of how all these theories of Gnostic origins, well, comes out of Platonism, comes out of Zoroastrian dualism, it comes out of this, that, and the other thing, Hermeticism. It's like there's evidence for each one of these things in Nag Hammadi. It's amazing.
There is. That's right. I've done that exercise as a thought experiment. Let's take these texts and try to prove that their background is Platonic, and then you try to prove that their background is Zoroastrian, and then you try to prove that their background is Hermetic, and so forth. And you can make really solid ground for each of those. Did you say the guy was a anthroposophist? Did you say? Is that what you said he was?
I don't think I even have the book anymore, though I reviewed it so I could find out and send you the information, because I reviewed it in the Journal of Higher Criticism at some point, but I could find it without too much difficulty.
Yeah, so he'd be sensitive to Zoroastrian influences there, I guess, because of anthroposophy has that sort of Zoroastrian structure to it, strangely enough. Yeah.
I wonder what the whole field of Christian origins, etc., will look like in 100 years, when they've had time to plumb all these questions, because I just don't believe they've even scratched the surface of
No, we haven't. Well, we should. I don't think we should assume that that it will get more adventurous or more liberal. That doesn't necessarily follow. The progress narrative doesn't apply here, I don't think. Because we know this from, the Dutch radicals and the Tübingen school and so forth. Criticism was much more radical in the 19th century than in the 20th. So how did that happen? You'd think with more texts and more discoveries and opening up and everything that it would go the other way. In fact, biblical scholarship became more and more conservative in the 20th century. So it's hard to explain. Yeah.
That's why I want to hold up the torch for radical criticism in the Journal of Higher Criticism. It may have very little, almost no circulation, but somebody's got to try to carry the torch.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. I agree. I think it's a task that needs to be done, but we shouldn't assume that the scholarship will go in any particular direction. It may, it may not. There's nothing guaranteed about those sorts of things.
Right.
I always take the view that there's always new discoveries. There's always new ways of looking at things. There's always ways of revisiting things which you thought were settled. So that task goes on. You can always revisit things, but we shouldn't assume. I don't think we should assume that the academic system and everything as it is going to go in a particular direction, that it's going to open up and become more liberal or more adventurous or anything like that. I don't. That doesn't necessarily follow.
Yeah.
On the contrary. On the contrary, it may close down into a new orthodoxy, a new, it doesn't matter that it's secular, it's still a new orthodoxy. And in this field in particular, biblical studies, that's what keeps happening. It just keeps reforming into a new orthodoxy. And then someone shakes it up and then it reforms itself. And so it goes. It's a strange field, academic biblical studies, in that regard.
Yeah, there's this kind of involvement people have because of their upbringing religiously, even if they've rejected it, like Bart Ehrman, that keeps them thinking in the same basic pattern.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's very hard to extract yourself from that. I agree. Very difficult. We carry much more baggage than we know. As I say, my approach to this is largely Platonic, so I'm interested in the Platonism in the Gnostic texts. That's largely my interest. But I also get from Plato, as I was saying earlier, that tension between mythos and logos, between myth and the logical account. And also, of course, you get in Plato, most spectacularly, you get the idea of the noble lie.
Oh, yeah.
And that is a current idea in the ancient world. That's a powerful idea in the ancient world. The noble lie. I'm very interested in how that goes into things. See, I have, there's another matter entirely, but I have grave doubts about the Aristotelian corpus and its legitimacy. But anyway, that's another matter.
Tell me more. I've had an ignorant suspicion of this for years. That I read that somebody found a trunk with all these manuscripts, and I thought, wait a minute, that sounds too Book of Mormon for me. And I wondered if there were much later. Is that what you're talking about? I'd love to hear.
I mean, I don't go into this publicly very often because you get so much stick for it. But largely, I think that the Aristotelian the Aristotelian books are late Roman productions rather than Greek early Greek productions. In fact, I'll tell you what I think happens. What I think happens is you have Plato and the school, but Plato's largely the end of a process rather than the beginning. We think of him as the beginning. We think of him as a founder of the academy and so forth. I think he's largely the end of the process, and that the whole show falls apart pretty much after that. But then you have Alexander the Great, and you have the growth of the mythology of Alexander the Great. There's an enormous proliferation of mythology about Alexander the Great. And I think what happens is that in the Roman period, they want to establish Alexander as the philosopher king, as the model of the philosopher king, as the wise ruler, the wise invader, the benevolent dictator, the benevolent empire. That idea, the benevolent empire. And I think what they do is they try to attach Alexander to Plato on the basis they want to make him philosopher king. But they invent the character of Aristotle to join the two characters together. So it goes Plato, they need to join Plato with Alexander the Great. And so they put a Macedonian in there in the middle. And I think this is done in the period of Sulla. What happens is that Sulla, you see, Aristotle's works supposedly just go completely missing for what, 300 years? Totally missing. Well, what happens is that Sulla invades Rome, and effectively they steal Greek culture. They take prisoner huge numbers of scribes and slaves and books. They import the whole thing. They effectively, they want to make Rome into the new Athens. And so they import it. And the story is that Sulla, when he arrived in Athens, was taken to a basement somewhere and was shown the lost works of Aristotle sitting in a basement. And so he took them back to Rome. But in fact, even then, we're told that another character rewrote them. If you look into the history of the Aristotelian texts, it's very weird. But they go missing for several hundred years and then turn up unexpectedly in Roman hands. And I'm very suspicious about the whole thing. That's not to say that they're not fantastic philosophy.
Oh yeah.
But I think that they largely come out of the school of Cicero and people like that.
Wow.
Yeah. And you can tell this Aristotle does not know Plato. We spent 2,000 years trying to reconcile the two thinkers because they don't match. What's an example? There's all sorts of examples of Aristotle saying Plato said such and such. Well, no, he didn't. He seems to have a very loose acquaintance with Plato in lots of areas. Some really unexplained stuff.
So
but you can explain it. You can explain it by putting those texts in a different period.
So are you saying basically this is Sullan Cicerone propaganda that's Platonizing Alexander the Great with something like that?
Largely I think that's what happened. That's right. I think that the Aristotelian corpus is later, and that Aristotle wasn't a student of Plato nor a teacher of Alexander. I think that's the myth. The myth is that this character was a student of Plato and a teacher of Alexander.
Do you think at the end of the tunnel that there was a historical Aristotle at all? Or
yeah, there seems to have been an early poet named Aristotle that they've loaded up with this stuff. I think that's probably what happened.
So another Paul situation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it shows me just how good the Romans were at this. They are fantastic at this. They are really good. But this is a discovered literature they discovered in the basement of somewhere in Athens. Which does happen. Look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah. Books do go missing. That does happen, but it's nevertheless suspicious, isn't it? Yeah, I'll send you a. I'll send you a sketch of an article on that. I've got an article on that.
Yeah, I'd like that too.
Yeah. I'll send it on. And so it is a parallel case with Paul. It's a sort of a parallel case. That's right.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sheesh. Amazing. Wow. Yeah, and I'll dig up the thing about the other apostle with Muhammad and the
I'm really interested in that.
Yeah.
That's potentially two more shows right there.
No.
It's got to happen. I want to talk about this. This is fascinating. I've never heard of this stuff about what you said, Dr. Blackhirst, about Aristotle's works being later. That's fascinating.
Once again, it's a case of in the Renaissance scholars who were really hot on this sort of stuff, very super critical. They picked it up straight away. There's some Renaissance scholars that put question marks behind Aristotle, but it's sort of like too big a fish. No, you can't deal with it. How can you deal with it? It's a bit like saying Jesus was a myth. It's hard to get your mind around. But let's have a sober look at it, and you'll see what I mean. Aristotle, yeah.
Well, here's another booby trap. My teacher, Darrell Dowdy, pointed out that in Philip Schaff's History of the Church, he says that the original of Irenaeus's Against Heresies is in some library somewhere in his day. And Dowdy said, wait a minute, how could that possibly be that much later? And of course, that raises the question if that's not also a backdated pseudepigraphon, but it's hard to buy because like the descriptions of Valentinianism seem to match pretty well with the Nag Hammadi texts, and somebody that late probably wouldn't know that, but that's another one I've been intrigued by.
Yeah. To what extent are we all entangled in backstories? Very big backstories that are really hard to disentangle yourself from. How to think outside those boxes is really hard. Yeah. I don't push the Aristotle business too much because my main interest here is that I want to stop reading Plato through Aristotle. That's why I do that sort of thing. But when you look at it, there's lots of question marks about Aristotle.
Boy, oh boy. Well, I guess I should probably get going. I've been doing podcasts all day.
Have you?
Yeah, I did two of mine that I've been neglecting. I've been on a lot of other people's the last couple of weeks, but I do one, the Bible Geek, and another, the Human Bible. And I finally got around to sitting down and doing both of those again today. And every day this week and next, I think I have, I'm appearing on Myth Vision, Gnostic Informant, and all this stuff, which is loads of fun. I'm not complaining.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Well, I appreciate you both joining me again.
Yeah, what's the time there now? It's it's early. It's in the morning here. So
6:26 p.m. I think.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I'll get to work this evening trying to dig up those references.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's no hurry, but if you could, that'd be great. I'm very interested.
Could you send them to me too, Dr. Price? I'll be
very you bet.
Awesome.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has really been great.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much more to be said about Paul, though, and the Gnostic text. Perhaps we should tackle a particular Nag Hammadi text or something like that at some stage, and go through a sort of base the discussion in a
we're definitely going to be doing more shows together. Definitely.
Yeah, I hope so. That'd be fun.
100%.
Fun, Jacob. Yeah,
I'd love to study the Apocryphon of John.
Sure.
Because I have this question about, can you trace some trajectory through the Johannine literature all the way through that? And I'm not familiar enough with it yet, but that's what I'd like to look into.
That sounds like another show by itself.
Yeah.
Oh
boy.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.